Alrighty, well, maybe I will get started as everyone starts trickling in. I know we had quite a few people registered to attend, so I'm very excited to get started, and I don't want to waste any time. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Tyler Durbano, and I'm the assistant curator here at the MacLaren Art Centre, and you're reaching me in the Prints and Drawings room at the MacLaren in downtown Barrie, and I use he, they pronouns. Before we get started, as always, I'd like to offer a land acknowledgement. It's important to acknowledge that the gallery is located on the unceded traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, which include the Odawa, Ojibwe, and Bodwe-Otomé nations, collectively known as the Three Fires Confederacy. The local bands consist of the Chippewa Tribe Council, who are made up of Beausoleil First Nation, Georgina Island First Nation, and Rama First Nation. And I'd also like to acknowledge the Wendat Huron Nation who occupied these lands prior to the middle of the 17th century. As a settler, I'm grateful to live and work in this place, and I hope that through land acknowledgements like this, we can remind ourselves about the peoples that care for the land and the land itself. I'm delighted to be hosting this artist curator talk between MacLaren exhibiting artist Rachel MacFarlane and curator Emily McKibbon. As I said before, feels like a little homecoming. I remember the first time Emily introduced me to Rachel. Rachel was visiting the gallery maybe in 2018, and we did a little tour of the vaults. And as we chatted and pulled out the racks, one of the paintings that was revealed was a Doris McCarthy landscape called Rock Movement No. 4. And this work, if you've ever seen any of Doris McCarthy's geometric abstractions, it pushes sort of farther than Doris McCarthy usually pushes into that abstract space. And it really conveys just how much of a distinct viewpoint she had on the landscape. And after chatting with Rachel in the vaults and having experienced her exhibition here for the last 3 months, it's hard to deny that Rachel has a very distinct viewpoint on the landscape she encounters as well. So I'm excited to chat about that. As an introduction to Rachel, Rachel MacFarlane has an MFA from Rutgers University, a BFA from OCAD, and a Certificate of Advanced Visual Studies from OCAD U Florence program. She's had solo exhibitions throughout Canada and has participated in group exhibitions internationally. She was awarded a 2019 Elizabeth Greenshields Foundation grant, a 2019 Vermont Studio Center residency, the Doris McCarthy Artist in Residence at Fool's Paradise in Scarborough, the NASCAD Robert Pope Artist Residency at NASCAD University in Halifax, a Triangle Artist Workshop at NYC. The list does go on. She's very, very talented. Her work is in public and private collections, including the Doris McCarthy Gallery at U of T, Equitable Bank, Stikeman Elliott, Royal Bank of Canada, just to name a few. And she currently teaches at Rutgers University in New Jersey and is represented by Nicolas Metivier in Toronto and Norberg Hall Gallery in Calgary. Her exhibition here, Broken Images Where the Sun Beats, closes on March 6th in 2 days' time. So I'd encourage you to check it out if you haven't already. It's a wonderful show. And I'd also encourage you to read the fantastic essay by Emily McKibbon, who curated the show as well. Emily is an award-winning writer and curator of settler descent with over 10 years experience in Canada and internationally. She's the former associate director, senior curator of the MacLaren Art Centre in Barrie, and she joined the curatorial staff as assistant curator of photography and collections in 2013. From 2011 to 2013, she was the Howard and Carol Tenbaum Curatorial Fellow at the George Eastman Museum in Rochester, New York, and she's worked in curatorial collections of research capacities at the Getty Research Institute in LA, Ryerson Image Center in Toronto, National Museum of the Royal New Zealand Navy, Auckland, Seneca College in Toronto, and University of Guelph. Her writing has been published in Canadian Art, Sea Magazine, Prism International, Room Magazine, The New Quarterly, and other literary periodicals. And she's received numerous awards and recognitions. I would encourage you to check out her new website and familiarize yourself with all of those awards as well. What is the most recent one? recently won an award for writing on a wonderful painting by Frances Thomas, and she's now based in Toronto. So without any further ado, I'll pass it over to Emily and Rachel, and I'll share my screen so we can see some images of Rachel's work. Take it away.
Yeah, so I believe Rachel's going to kick us off with just giving a kind of brief overview of her exhibition at the MacLaren. Tyler has very generously created a PowerPoint deck that will show on the screen as we chat. But yeah, I'm curious to hear a bit from Rachel.
It would help if I unmuted myself. Hi, everyone, and thanks, Emily and Tyler. I guess I want to start by just thanking both of you and also everyone else at the MacLaren for being so wonderful to work with, and the people at Nicholas Metivier Gallery, which really helped me put together the show and sort of act as a liaison with, especially with the shipment of the work and everything. So, yeah, it was a strange beginning to really organizing this show because we had plans for this exhibition, and then the pandemic hit, so we never had a full studio visit. So there's somehow the format of producing this show and then the concerns I have actually in the work kind of came together, because these paintings are really about investigating a kind of loss of being in specific landscape sites. And so that we couldn't do this sort of experiential thing of being in a studio together and had to work through the screen became kind of a kind of touchstone for the meaning of these pieces. So that's a weird way to start. I want to start with some like concrete things about these works, which is that each one of these paintings is based on a specific trip, like a research site trip that I did. So I went to Newfoundland. We did like a sort of 10-day trip there, but we ended up in Gossamer National Park. I went to Sedona and the Grand Canyon in Arizona, also to visit sort of these protected park areas, and also to New Orleans in Louisiana, so to visit the Bayou. So each one of those trips were supported by the Elizabeth Greenshields Foundation, as well as Canada Arts Council grants, which was like a huge gift to be able to make this body of work. And so a little bit about why I chose those specific places. And actually, maybe it's nice that Tyler, you brought up Doris McCarthy, because the whole trajectory of my work into issues of landscape started with a residency I did at the Doris McCarthy Fool's Paradise cabin. And that's sort of what launched me off into the space of working with landscape iconography and working with my methodology of working with models began to kind of change in the subject matter from there. Because previously I worked with models that were more of like invented spaces that were more architectonic. They were more about architecture and urban spaces. And while I was there, I realized that they were all about memories of spaces. And when I set out to do this project with these specific landscape sites, New Orleans and Sedona and Gossamer, it was because I wanted to see what would happen, what would change if I was more pointed about the places that I went, and then tried to like build this process. So essentially what I did was I went out and did these little excursions, and I spent time in these landscapes, either hiking or writing or, you know, taking little sort of watercolor notations. And then what I do is I come back into my studio and I build these paper models, these collages, sort of 3D collages. And then that's what I eventually paint from. So there's a kind of slippage between the space, the rebuilding of the memory of the place, and then the final painting. So I chose these 3 locations because they're all really diverse as far as like what kind of ecology you'll experience in those places. And they're really outside of my own formative experience of landscape, which is, you know, actually very close to the MacLaren and the Oro Medonte area, Aurora, and kind of that surrounding Ontario Shield kind of area. So I wanted to experience sites that had their own kind of specific vegetation, specific rock formations. And then I also really wanted to investigate places that were protected parks, because I'm interested in how we frame nature, and I'm kind of critical of the way that we create these boundaries around quote unquote natural spaces, because while it's good that we protect them, it also allows us to sort of say this is protected, and then these other areas that don't fall within those bounds, they're allowed to be affected by an endless litany of things that are bad for them because they're outside of those bounds. So that framing, and you'll see a lot of framing devices in these paintings as well, which are kind of residue of the frame of the model box that I build the models in. Is sort of an important part of what I was investigating, that this, I don't know, the space between the real lived temporal experience of feeling the sunlight on your body in these landscape spaces, and then the removal from those, the kind of loss, meditating on loss of these landscape sites, and then also the kind of rebuilding them, that artifice, and thinking about all sorts of simulated spaces and digital media, and how that further removes us from those spaces as well. I think I'm gone on too long already, so I'm gonna stop here. I think that's a good place to stop. Emily, what do you think?
Well, I think that's fantastic. And yeah, it's always been a pleasure to talk about your work. And so much of our work over the past, I guess, 2 or 3 years has been online. So it's sort of interesting having this conversation in public, because we've been having it in a sort of closed virtual space for so long.
So many Zoom calls.
So many Zoom calls. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think it took us a while even to land on Zoom, because I think we started it with Google. So
That's true, actually.
yeah, the technology, the sort of layers of technology. And thinking about technology, and thinking also about what you've talked about in terms of direct experience, feeling the sun on your face, all of those things. I was curious to talk a bit about science fiction, specifically E.M. Forster's The Machine Stops, which is as you know, it's a story about this cast of characters living in this technologically advanced sort of world floating over the surface of the earth, which has become inhospitable, and they experience the world through these screens effectively. That, I believe, was written in 1909. Is that right?
Oh, I don't quote me on a date. That's not in my head. But yeah.
Okay, well, certainly an early piece of
yeah.
Exactly. And so I was just reading a book, and Isabel Stenger was quoted in it, and she writes about science fiction as the missing thought experience. The missing thought experiments. So the missing art of consequences, which are generally ignored by scientists. And so she sort of says that these books, these works of fiction, remind us that what we face is not some mythical sudden end of the world, but a long process, and our children and the children of our children will have to go along and live in the technologically sophisticated ruins of our dreams. I think people have written quite a bit, I think, about the kind of high key color that you use, the kind of formal elements of your paintings in terms of the screen. But I thought maybe you could talk a bit about that, because I think in some ways what your work does is it kind of reintroduces and amplifies that moment of looking.
Yeah, there's a lot to respond to there. Well, science fiction for me is one of the top things that influences my work. I have a list of influences in front of me, and it's Ursula Le Guin, Tarkovsky, Stalker, all these really poignant science fiction that uses landscape as at least an overarching way of talking about loss, or as the entity that really like needs to be highlighted in them. I'm in the middle of rereading The Dispossessed by Ursula Le Guin right now, which is like such a fantastic book that it touches on so many parts of what I'm interested in. And I was thinking about this a little bit because last time we talked with Tyler, we were talking about the kind of like vitality of some of the life forms in the paintings, like, you know, whether it's like a tendril of a plant or you know, the way that, I don't know, they feel like portraits too. And I was thinking about like, why do I do that? And I do feel like I'm trying to like decenter the human presence in these paintings to kind of give these spaces an uncanny feeling of vitality or life. And I think science fiction is partly what has led me to want to do that. It's about like what you said about that science fiction becomes this method to highlight these things that, you know, maybe we can see are coming straight at us, but we haven't made moves to course correct. And definitely there's like a prescient kind of warning that I'm trying to show in these paintings where we're not part of the landscape. You know, it's what happens after that time. What is somehow I feel like they're paintings about the future a bit. But then they're also paintings about loss, and then I get like confused about exactly like the focal point. And I don't think I need to work it out, but I know that those things are kind of bubbling at the surface of like what my concerns are. Not sure if I answered your question, just so much as like I really relate to a lot of science fiction, and that story by Ian Forrester, and I think maybe it's like extra poignant because it's like his only piece of science fiction. It really like just the whole setup of these people living in these like kind of pod sounds a bit hooey, but like, you know, they're in these like individualized rooms where they're accessing like even like lectures. They talk about them watching lectures online and like sort of this flood of information that makes them still feel like they're part of a world, part of a society, but then they're not able to visit the surface of the earth. And they're sort of barred from that. And it makes me think about, I don't know, how Elon Musk is, you know, trying to make us move to Mars, you know, basically, not immediately, obviously, but I just feel like, are you kidding me? Like we're destroying what we have right here. We need to like put our focus back on these spaces. And if not, they'll for sure live without us. Sort of what I feel like I'm in a way making paintings about. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that makes perfect sense. It's funny. I mean, when we first talked about doing this artist talk, it was before obviously everything that's happening in Ukraine. But also, I think before the IPCC released their latest report on climate change, where, you know, and this is, I think, quite typical of climate science lately, is that each report is sort of more dire than expected, and this one was certainly that. And so you think through issues like, you know, less than 2 degrees above what was typical in 1850s, and all of a sudden half the human population will experience sporadic climate events that are, I don't know how to say it, but just sort of inhospitable to life-threatening climate events like the heat dome, for example, that happened out on the West Coast this year. So it is interesting to think through what that missing piece is in terms of climate science, and interesting that this theorist is sort of saying that science fiction is in some ways a kind of adjunct to climate science, and that it allows us to articulate consequences in a way that's much more immediate. And so it's interesting. I read that after I wrote the essay and after the show went up. And I think at the beginning, when you shared that story with me, I didn't quite get it. And I had to sit with it for a little bit of time before I kind of realized the point that you were trying to make, which I think is a really salient and really interesting point. So that's excellent. So one of the sites that you're quite interested in, and I don't think it appears in the show, but it's been one that's been important to you for a long time, is the Case Woodlot in Aurora, so quite close to where you grew up. I want to think a little bit about your work and the concept of deep time, because I think one of the things that people have said with climate change is that climate change and our inability to really grapple with it is a consequence of, our inability to really understand deep time. And I think, you're really interested in kind of capturing these quote unquote pristine landscapes that were kind of set aside by settler states. And Case Woodlot is a great example of that, because it's only, I think, it's not a pristine landscape. I think that whole area was clear cut about 100 years ago, maybe 130 years ago, during the late settlement period. So in terms of landscapes, it's actually quite a recent one, and a colonial landscape as well. Do you want to talk about how you introduce these sort of layers of artifice to point to these kind of histories in these supposedly pristine landscapes?
Sure. Maybe I'd just talk about my relationship to Case Woodlot, kind of formatively as like an entry point into that. Basically, like I grew up in Aurora. It's a suburban community, and our house had a fence that bordered this area. Of course, I didn't turn off my phone. Great. Sorry. So our house like bordered this area, which is like you said, is like not an old growth forest, but it's now a forest nonetheless, and it existed as this like kind of preserved place. It has like little trails going through it, has a really cute pond named Salamander Pond, and it was a place where like I would play constantly with my friends and my family, but it's also completely encased by a line of suburban, very like cookie cutter kind of houses. And I think that I was talking with another artist friend about this the other day, there is something kind of specific about the time in which I was at least like a youth, being more conscientious of technology and those moments of play, I guess, was right at the time where like it was a decision between being on your bike all day or being like really immersed in a video game space, and so we didn't have CD-ROMs yet. We didn't have the internet, but I was right at that moment where both things were kind of happening simultaneously. And I think that divide and the fact that, the generations that are coming up now are all immediately, introduced to the internet and screen like technology, and not maybe leading to those outdoor spaces as like the primary place of play is kind of an important like kind of societal shift that has happened. I don't know if this is off topic, but it like for me, Case Woodlot is in my own body and like and my own personal history is that's the other to those other playful spaces, so it is kind of like a stand-in for how important the lived, timely, temporal experience of landscape is, and that actual relationship to it was very meaningful to me growing up. But obviously that space exists only in this kind of the societal architecture and physical architecture that allows it to exist. And it's now that I'm like older and more scrutinizing and not a child investigating that space with sort of like just pure enjoyment, it's sort of a stand-in for, the complicatedness of how we view those spaces and what kind of stock we put into them and whether or not we put any stock into them at all. I worry a little bit that there isn't that kind of investigation or play in those spaces. And I guess when we were talking earlier about how science fiction is maybe like an extra piece and like a conversation about climate change, I feel sort of the same way where I'm like, this I'm not an expert on like the facts and figures of climate change. Like I'm a wholehearted believer in that it's happening and it's a disaster, you know. But I feel like as an artist, the one thing you can do is sort of shift your lens to looking and investigating things that you feel like are being lost or not highlighted enough. And that for me is looking at the framing of how we allow quote unquote natural spaces to exist and how we frame ourselves outside of those spaces too. And I think I was listening to Timothy Morton talk, who has been scrutinized for all sorts of things. One being that a lot of his theory is like, you could easily just be looking at First Nations communities and say that they've had those beliefs for a really long time. But he's still an interesting person to listen to about these issues. And what was he talking? Now I've lost my train of thought. Because even talking about that is really interesting. Like, how do I, as a white settler, even approach these issues of landscape? And I think that there are better communities to be doing it. And I think part of it is that it's responding to that language that I'm embedded in, which is like suburban white settler, you know, one that's inundated by like digital images and media all the time, and trying to find a way to use that language or critique that language and talk about this issue. And I think framing devices and using that to kind of pull apart these spaces is part of whatever my project is. I don't know if I answered your question. I've just gone on a tangent about I don't know, but yeah, that's my personal feelings about Case Woodlet. It's hard for me to extract that site that like was so important to me as a youth from. It's hard for me not to be a little bit like emotional about it, I guess.
No, and I think that's one of the interesting and kind of challenging things about working in the arts these days. I think that kind of self-reflexivity is, you know, incumbent on us, but it does sort of complicate, you know, feelings of love, you know, with feelings of criticism. And I think it's something that you navigate very interestingly in your practice because you are, as you say, a landscape painter. And certainly in Canada, landscape painting is absolutely implicated in the colonial project. It is inseparable from it. Tyler, sorry, I was about to call Tyler Ty, which is a sign of my deep affection for Ty. Tyler mentioned the Doris McCarthy residency, and you've mentioned it as well. The exhibition you did with Metivier Gallery shortly after finishing the residency, I think was a moment in which I sort of knew about your practice before, but I really fell in love with the practice after that. Working in, you know, the landscape and especially being sort of responsive to its history, which is complicated, is really complicated emotionally as well as formally and aesthetically. And I think we've talked about Doris McCarthy as someone that we both love. I'm a huge fan of Georgia O'Keeffe, you know, even as I'm uncomfortable with, you know, the kind of O'Keeffe that we live with, the O'Keeffe legend. Do you want to talk a little bit about this? Because I think having complicated, ambivalent, competing, being kind of implicated as a fan, but also implicated as a critic, I think is common and certainly worth untangling. So maybe you wanted to chat about that.
Yeah, I don't even know where to start. But yeah, it's complicated. You know, it took me a long time to even approach images of landscape. And I think, and it wasn't until Doris McCarthy's residency that I even decided to try. And I think it was the privacy there. It was like a residency all on my own. You know, I was the only person there. I was there for 3 months, and it allowed me to kind of challenge what my work was about. It also liberated me. Like I felt like no one was watching, even though those paintings ended up being seen. I felt like I could experiment and be a little bit more risky, like with what I was painting. And there was a kind of realization where I it dawned on me that maybe I was always kind of doing this project, because work I did in 2000 and, oh, I don't remember what year that was, maybe 2011, a show I had at Nicholas Mativier also, were these sort of like industrial kind of forms on these like watery kinds of like setting, like in these watery kinds of setting. And I used to bike all the time out to like Leslie Spit and like to Humber Bridge in Toronto. And I realized that they're all kind of portraits of like looking out onto Toronto from like far away, you know, or from Toronto Island. And often at night, because I bike a lot at night, which is a little bit of a creepy thing to do. But I think I realized that I was always calling on some sort of space that I had an experience in my work. And it was out being in the Scarborough Bluffs that I realized that there's like an important part about talking about the sense of loss that I wanted to like take on. And I felt like the model for me is a bit of like the paper model that I built for the paintings is a bit of like a device that allows me to approach the subject of landscape without like kind of co-opting or like claiming ownership over those spaces. Because there is, like, as you like eloquently said, like the colonial project in landscape painting, like, is, you know, it's implicated, and it is about like, or it was about, I mean, and it certainly still is, for some people. And I'm not going to say that I do it perfectly. I don't know if I'm doing it perfectly. Like I worry about it and think about it constantly. But I feel like that a lot of early landscape paintings in Canada, like Group of Seven, you know, Emily Carr, was about like going out to these spaces not yet explored and illustrating them to kind of package them as Canadian, you know, and that's where the problem lies. It's that simple, as that is a nationalist framing of spaces that, you know, we're not Canadian unceded territories, right? So like that I'm weary about or leery of doing as a painter, and I want to be like very cautious of it. But I also know that there's a real importance to me to talk about issues of how we frame, you know, landscape. And I've talked about that already. I'm gonna repeat it, but it was hard for me to even think about how do I make images about this. And then it's complicated also by the fact that I love a lot of those painters, you know, that I think Doris McCarthy was like incredibly earnest. Like she was 90 going out into the art tent, maybe not 90, but she was up there, you know, still making these trips and finding it important to make sure that this was looked at, you know. And I feel the same way about a lot of those painters. So it's just like what you said, it's love and it's critical, like it's both all at once. And I think it's important, if we care about something, to take it to the next step. And I think that like a critical view, one that like doesn't completely abandon everything that came before it, but kind of reworks it and tries to reframe it, is necessary with that kind of work. And so that's, yeah, it's like maybe a lot for me to take on as a painter, but it's something I've always got like lurking in the back of my mind as I like make these paintings. But I think the model, like I said, it's a device that helps me like distance myself from feeling like I am quote unquote like stealing this image from somewhere. Like it's always imbued through my own play. It's always removed. It's not an empirical recording. So it allows me to like feel like that's not happening as much. And I feel like you can sense it in the work that I'm not trying to do that, or at least I hope that you can. And y'all let me know if I'm not doing that. I would love to know. But it also is like, it's just also a playful space, like working with paper and collage and painting and physical, and removing all that in person, and just allowing it to be what it is that it's like a tincture of that space. It's just something from it that then gets rebuilt. That part's kind of important too, or else I don't think I'd be able to make work about the subject, I don't think.
Yeah, I think that's a really excellent point. I read, I think, a New Yorker article about Georgia O'Keeffe a couple of years ago, and they quoted her as saying about a mountain that was near her home in, I guess, was it Arizona or New Mexico? I always forget.
New Mexico.
New Mexico. So it was a mountain near her home, and she had written her friend, probably back in New York City, you know, this mountain is mine. God told me if I painted it enough, it would be mine. It's mine. And the author, sort of presented this kind of obstinate, kind of grouchy, fierce statement as a sign of kind of feminist success. You know, she was achieving the kind of mastery, quote unquote, that her male peers had, without sort of critiquing this idea that that's something we should aspire to. And so it is fascinating, and she's a complicated person to really admire. And I think that's something certainly worth grappling with. You talked a little bit about the maquettes as a way of sort of introducing a degree of separation between you and your landscapes. And certainly one of the kind of formal innovations in some of the more recent paintings, and you can see it on the screen here, is the introduction of the frame of the maquette itself and the final painting. Did you want to talk about maybe how you construct your paintings, your working process, and maybe chat with us about any changes that might have happened because of the pandemic?
Well, yeah, I have to think about that second part. But I can start by talking about the process. Sure, that's fine. Yeah, like I said, I go out into these landscapes, and I really try not, like, I do have like a whole book of watercolors. You know, I showed Emily them at some point, just really brief because they're not really for view.
Sorry, can I just interrupt for a second? Because you swore me to secrecy.
I know, I just
You
told
keep on telling people, and I've been keeping your secret for so long, and it has been painful.
Right, but you're not going to tell them about what they look like, I don't think. But
No.
I think that's just like my unabashed attitude towards things. Is if I have an embarrassing moment, I'm just going to tell everyone about it. I guess I was lying to you when I said I was going to keep it secret. Anyhow, well, but also it's a question I've gotten since having the show. Is I've had a lot of people ask me like, oh, you go into these landscapes, like, do you make studies? And then that's what these are derived from. And they're not, you know, there's the only one that maybe is an exception is actually the big piece from this exhibit, the Gossamer Dreams, which is this big piece that is in New Orleans. This one on the left of this image right now, the big piece is a little bit based on painting that I did in City Park in New Orleans. But otherwise, I am really just trying to soak up something about those spaces and then come back and build these sort of little models. You know, like, I'm really influenced by theater design and all sorts of miniatures and that kind of thing. So I start just by making, you know, swatches of watercolor paper, like sort of patterns and color, like kind of colorways. I build palettes that way by just like painting watercolor paper, letting it dry, having like kind of a big stack beside me. I use like all sorts of other kinds of papers, like Japanese papers, because they're really great. They have like really strong fibers in them, which are really great for sculpting. And I sit down and I just like play. I have like a scalpel, I have a big cutting board. I just like cut forms and try to use, I like have these small illustration board boxes that I paint the backgrounds in, but I also cut out sections of so that light can come in certain directions. And then I just play with forms. I like fold paper and I use this archival tape and I can move things around before I like settle them into a certain composition. And I try to get that sense of that place that I remember through these forms, through the you know, is the paper translucent? Does it let light through? Is it textured? Is it, you know, marbled because of something I did with the watercolor or gouache? And I try to get some semblance happening. And at the same time, I'm also like playing with abstraction and playing with color and light and form. And then the big thing that happened in this show and the show that I had at Mckibbin in like, which is sort of a similar timeline, is that the element of light is like kind of new. Like I was always playing with light in some ways, but I wasn't being nearly as intentional of it and intentional about it. And I started, my husband's a photographer, and he got me like a little book of light gels. So like you can get these sample books, they're just full of like every color light gels, which is perfect for my tiny models. So I've just been playing a lot with like colored light and how that can sort of signal a time of day, because that idea of like a moment in these spaces is really important to me. And I realized light was kind of the missing factor. And there's so many painters that I adore from the history of art that like have made like a lot of paintings are just about light, you know, they're about light and they're about touch, and those sort of themes are like, or methods are really at the forefront of like what I'm interested in when I'm making a painting. And so I use these tiny lights, actually maybe you can see some in the background there, but tiny lights and light gels. And I've been playing a lot with directionality. But with that, you know, we were looking at the smaller pieces, they were just on the screen. There's these funny moments of trompe l'oeil that make it obvious that the painting is, you know, only this deep, like that the space of the, rather the space of the painting of what I'm depicting is only this deep. And so we get these like trompe l'oeil shadows. We get like sometimes like a maquette box window, or actually we're like looking through a piece of like ripped paper. And those little moments for me are an important part of the kind of undoing of what the subject is, that this is artificial, this isn't a real landscape, there's a fallacy here, there's a fallibleness to the scene that it's painted from also. And but it's also a physical nod that you're looking at an object in a real space, in a real room, and it's not a photograph, and it's not from a study of being in the landscape, it's also this like still life right in front of you thing you can touch kind of moment. I don't know, is it, I forgot what your second question was that I wanted to think about. Can you remind me?
Oh, you know what? I asked you, and this is something we had talked about in the past as well. When you are, and that was specifically about whether or not the pandemic sort of shifted things for you, because you had a bunch of other trips planned, which of course fell through. But I think, you know, even at the time, when I asked you the first time, your answer, I think, was really just that you were accustomed to kind of recreating these spaces from memory. And so, you know, what really changed, I think, was experimentations with light, experimentations with the maquettes themselves. So it allowed a kind of refinement of your practice. And that's usually something that comes with time. Maybe not a refinement of your practice, but of this very specific way of creating from the maquette. Now, Tyler, you're welcome to interject with any questions, but also the audience is welcome to pose any questions that they might have. I, of course, have many questions that I could ask you, but I don't want to take over. Tyler, is there anything you might be curious about? Oh, and we have a question from Francis.
Yeah, I have some questions here, which is pretty good.
Okay, well, did you want to read them out, Ty?
Sure. Let me see here. Francis says, I think I heard you mention Timothy Morton, who I have found to be an interesting thinker, and he said the following: the inner fragility of a thing is why a thing can exist at all. Fragility is also why anything at all can happen. Existence is incompleteness. This fragility is activated in what is called destruction. This is the kind of fragility I'm feeling here. And I am struck with your ability to speak to fragility in such a concrete way in your forms. Is that a tension that you think about, Rachel?
Yeah, what a great quote. I was the lecture I was watching just a few days ago. He was talking a lot about you know, interconnectedness is like way too simplified of a word for what he talks about. But I think it's important to acknowledge that we're as fragile as like these landscapes I'm investigating, you know, and that we're all part of this kind of fabric of what is ecology, and we're not outside of it. That I think is like one of the most important takeaways or things I'm like personally focused on, like maybe even outside of my work, is this idea of not othering landscape, you know. And I think fragility is like a really important part of that. And yeah, I like what you're saying, that I'm being concrete about fragility, which I think is really funny, almost like word salad a bit. But I relate to that. I was thinking about it. I was like, why do I make, like, I'm interested in loss, but then I make these paintings that are actually like very still and super concrete because they're made of these, you know, while paper is fragile in it's really material what I'm looking at. And I was like, oh, it's because I want to like freeze these moments so that we can talk about how they're always in flux. It's like the contrast that I'm interested in. And it's a little bit more like a memorial than it is like an activated in real. I feel like I'm just getting started with thinking about fragility. I feel like, Francis, you got this in my head, and I'm going to keep it with me and continue to like think about how does fragility come into this work, because I know it's there, especially in these ideas of loss. I don't know if that answers your question, but I hope it does. Okay, good.
That's a very Francis Thomas question, the one that sort of plants a seed and then, yeah, it's not that you'll wake up at 3 a.m. tomorrow morning with an answer. It's that you'll wake up 3 years from now at 3 a.m. in the morning with an answer.
Why does it have to be 3 a.m.?
I know, the witching hour.
We have another question we have an additional question. So from Sean, thanks so much for your crystal clear articulation on your work. It's important for me to remember that some of the touchstones I see in your work are vital: Carr, Harris, and Brooker. You bring them forward and make their ideas your own. I wish Tarkovsky met you.
Oh, yeah, that would have been cool. Thanks. I don't know if there was a question in there, but
I don't think I say question, but really it's just a lovely comment.
Yeah, it was just a lovely comment. I know Tarkovsky is great, but I love Brooker and Harris a lot. And I think also both of their work is actually really nice to revisit, because what they're really known for, like sort of in capital C Canadian art, isn't actually what they ended up keep doing. Their projects kind of expanded and became about something outside of only the colonial project, especially with Warren Harris. And I think he's really worth looking at, actually. And I love his like late abstractions, which not a lot of people talk about or maybe don't like, but I'm on team abstract Harris.
Yeah, the abstractions from Harris are pretty remarkable. They're really different, but they're gems for sure.
You can definitely see the thread line, or whatever the word is.
So we have a question from Jill, and it's a question. Jill says, when you think of how landscapes are being destroyed, how do you navigate or contend with the reality that artists contribute to the Anthropocene colonization of land through our material processes?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I don't have a way of contending with it. I don't think any of us do. Like, I don't know, because the issues for me are like so much more systemic than they are personal. And while I think that like your personal actions can lead forward and lead by example, and I believe in that as well, we're really looking at like a global project that needs to change. And I wouldn't say that like my work even purports to be like primarily focused on climate change, even though it's like a part of what I'm looking at in how we experience and like view landscape. So certainly I am not outside of like a capitalist or anthropocentric project. You know, none of us are. It would take a lot to divest our personal actions from this overall project that's happening. And it's kind of, it's not a very, it's a pretty bleak answer is what I'm giving you. It's a pretty bleak answer. And I guess, yeah, I don't see myself outside of the problem. I don't know if that helps answer your question. Can you read the question again? Actually, am I answering it? I think I am.
Yeah, I can answer, or I can read it again. When you think of how landscapes are being destroyed, how do you navigate or contend with the reality that artists contribute to the Anthropocene or colonization of land through our material processes?
Yeah. She agrees. Things are bleak. Yeah, things are bleak. You know, I feel like it's also, I don't think on a personal level we as artists can like undo this. I think our only like hope is to like make sure that we're highlighting what's going on, what is the overall issue. If you figure this out, please let me know. You know, a way to do it better.
Can I just interject very quickly before we go to Renee's excellent question about painting? It's a real head scratcher, so Rachel, you'll have to dig deep. One of the things I find really interesting about your work, and I think especially when you consider issues of climate change, but also our kind of contemporary moment where I think nostalgia has been really weaponized and picked up by the kind of right wing as a kind of desire to return things to a non-existent but very kind of romanticized past. Yeah, it's to me, I find that tension between sort of nostalgia and critique really interesting. But again, that is perhaps something to do maybe with your subject rather than your working process. But anyway, you don't have to respond to that. We can always go to Renee's question if that's a sort of non-question statement.
No, I'm just pausing and thinking about it because like I don't think, I'm just thinking about nostalgia. I think, and it actually kind of plays into her question, I think, about painting as a project at large. So I think my work is very nostalgic. Like I think it's, you know, just even looking at still life painting, there's I think about the painters that I even enjoy. It's like far outside of just landscape painting. I feel like Morandi and like Cezanne and like people who looked at processes of vision and how to even capture a subject. All those things play into my work, and I'm a big believer in not abandoning everything, but continuing on with vestiges of parts of the medium that you're working in, and having it respond in a different way to what is this current moment. And this current moment is one that I see where we're getting a separation from environmental spaces in a way that's changing our meaning and understanding of them, and that one that is being further and further inundated into a digital realm, you know. And so yeah, I really believe in the synthesis between those two things. Does that make sense? I think so.
Mm-hmm. And that was in relation to Renee's question and about how your work sits between still life and landscape, the history of painting, and the very nature of the medium.
Maybe should we read it? I guess everyone can read it, right?
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah. So
go ahead.
No, Tyler, you have such a beautiful voice for reading. You read it.
Well, the lovely Renee says, do you consider your work a critique of painting itself? The way your work sits between still life and landscape and the complexity of your process seems to indicate that you're challenging not only the history of painting, but the very nature of the medium.
And that kind of ties into Ron Schubert's question. And then perhaps after that, we can talk about Carolyn Boyd's. So Tyler, will you give us Ron?
Hello, Rachel and Emily. Thank you for your valuable conversations and insights, including earlier precedents. I'm thinking of such other Canadian artists who have used the constructed artifice as a source, such as Art Green, Ron Moffat, John Hall, etc. You also just mentioned Morandi. Any further comments?
Oh yeah, these are all like some of my favorite painters. I love Ron Moffat's paintings. And yeah, Morandi's a great example. I mean, I could talk about the subject for a really long time. It's, you know, even Kay Sage is a female painter that I think is like a really great surrealist painter who I think really plays into that space also. So, you know, my primary objective when even starting to paint was really more about like ideas of artifice and illusion and how to deconstruct those inside of a painted space. And like I just said, that I feel like each one of these artists that we've even just mentioned has their own like point in time or their own personal history that has led to using painting as a medium to critique the structure of the understanding of objects and a vision within the field of painting in their own particular ways. And we were talking earlier about Case Woodlot and that kind of personal experience that I had there. And I think back on that constantly as like a touch point for me, and that choice between highly illusory screen space and like a material space, and the material being landscape there, but also like my hand in some mud, you know, like we're playing in a sandbox or what have you. And I think painting is like that place where those things really sandwich each other. It is the painted mud on the surface, and it is also this window. And that is like what makes painting the project of it endlessly worth investigating. And I think that the subject there, the investigation of that is in no way new. Like there's so many great examples. That list could just keep going on, Ron, you know, and I know that we would share a list happily together. What I'm trying to do is like make it about something specific or identify, and I'm sure that it's going to change, and I hope it does like continue to change and grow as I age and the world happens and changes around me, that it becomes about new things. But for me, that's what it's about at this moment.
So in that answer, you sort of touched on color, and you touched on the idea of artifice in your paintings. And at the beginning of the chat, you were speaking with Emily a little bit about sci-fi. And I think that sort of leads into Carolyn Boyd's question about your painted, she says, your painted forms really draw me in, and I'm memorized by the vibrating colors in your paintings. Do you choose your colors based on the initial impression of the landscape that inspires you?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. Yes, the answer is yes. And I guess I should expand on it a bit. I was rereading your essay, Emily, this morning, just to sort of get me in the right headspace. And it's so nicely written, and it expands on all these different topics in such a nice way. But you mentioned something that Mitch Speed had written about my work. Just this little quote about how it's about, I forget, I'd have to read it again to get his wording correctly, but he just like points out that that it is derived from the actual landscape, like trying to actually capture the vitality and like vibrancy of the landscape that I experience. And I think we are pretty out of touch with how amazing it is. That sounds really silly or hyperbolic, but I don't think it is. Like, I think that there, at least the experience that I had over the years, you know, doing the research for the show, or like the trips, I mean, doing the research for the show, I had endless moments where light and wind and movement like was worth thinking about how to capture in a painting. And it is extended and, you know, saturated and maybe amplified in my paintings, but I also feel like it's always going to be duller than the real thing, you know. So I'm trying to get close, but it's yeah, it's definitely, I feel like they're hinged upon each other, you know.
I think, and I'm gonna say this from memory, which means I'll misremember it, but sometimes misremembering is productive. But I think what Mitch Speed wrote about your work was that they were new screens through which to encounter or re-encounter life's actual vividness. And I know I got life's actual vividness right, because I thought that was actually a really beautiful turn of phrase, and a kind of reminder that actually life is actually vivid. Yeah.
It is. It makes me think about teaching painting and then having to try to get students to actually see the color that's in front of you, you know, and I mean, there's so many great painters who are good touchstones for that too. And to get that, like when they're painting a portrait and you try to get them to stop using skin tone and like see that like actually in this light that is pink and that is green and what have you, and like there we don't I think we're getting farther and farther away from actually analyzing or being like present and like witnessing that kind of, yeah, I don't know what I'm trying to say here, just so much as like that vividness is often lost. I'm pretty interested in like making sure it's highlighted.
So we have a few more questions, but I just wanted to jump in and talk about, when you were talking about vitality, like vitality is the perfect word to talk about what essence your painting has. It has this essence of vitality. I feel like it's so strong that it conveys like a sense of autonomy of the plants. Like they do feel like they are they're moving within their own landscape. They're in control of their own landscape. And I know that's part of that probably comes out of your process of making the maquettes and the whimsy that comes with that they sort of, and your memory as well. But I'm wondering if you ever think about, I wrote it down here, like the more than human perspective. And I think that's a conversation that's growing in art right now. I know like Jill Price gave us a question. I think she's interested in that. Michelle Wilson, who's graduate of Western Ontario, fantastic body of work, a recent work that talks about the more than human perspective. I'm wondering if that ever like is a center point in your work.
Absolutely, that is like happening. That's something I'm thinking about constantly, you know. And I really loved your like little Instagram story of all the like little moments where it feels like a hand or like something kind of beckoning you into that space from the, you know, body of the plant. I definitely like, I remember being in a critique with just like some artist friends of mine and someone saying like, why aren't there like any footprints or like acknowledgement of like humans in here? And I was like, and I hadn't been meditating on it long enough at that time. This was like maybe 5 years ago. But I remember being insistent that that not be the case, you know, like, no, that's not what this is about. And I think I'm trying to make, there's a lot of figurative painting that's happening right now. And I'm not against figurative painting. And there's a lot of people who have like a good reason to be making figurative painting still. But for me, these paintings are, if there's a figurative element, it is the plant life, it is the world, like is this quote unquote natural world, and trying to refocus the lens on that having some sort of strange vitality and some understanding where it has human, what's the right word? Like they're the protagonists in those stories. They're the main character. I want to develop some element of empathy for them, but also like a kind of otherness, because I do, you know, believe that if we can't find a way to like reverse what's happening, they're going to be around still and we'll be gone. Like, I know that that's bleak, but like, I fully believe that. And there was a moment, I was thinking about this last night that we were out in Grossmorn. We went to, I don't know if anyone's been there, but go, it's an amazing space. We were on the tabletops, which is like one of the few places in the world where you can actually stand on the Earth's mantle, which like somehow cooled there and was able to stay because of like the tectonic shift and like the specific location that's in, and don't quote me on how that worked. But I remember reading about it, and on top of there, you can't like the rock is it's kind of toxic. Like it doesn't like easily grow things die on it. But there are all these plants that you normally see in the Arctic that have like grown on the surface, and they grow in this like circular pattern because there's high winds and the rock like can just shuffle around. It's just like these kind of shards. It's been there for, I don't know, forever, what feels like forever. And it's still figured out a way to exist and to live. And when you see like, I don't know, trees that are like in Banff in the Rocky Mountains that are just like growing out on an angle, you know, and it just seems like a place where I could never stand, but it's figured out how a way to root itself, or the way that trees and like fungi can talk to each other. Like it is a living organism. They are completely capable of figuring out how to survive in this world. I think it's us, I mean, not to put the focus back on us, my whole point is to put the focus on that kind of autonomy. I think they are autonomous, you know, I think it is vital. And I think that we are kidding ourselves if we don't give it that attention that it requires. So that kind of personification of those elements is something I think about all the time. And it's like a bit Disney or something. It's like the more juvenile way of putting it, but I think it's sort of important. And there's a bit of humor with it, but it's also a pretty serious thing I'm thinking about.
You know, it is, when you said it is a little bit Disney, it is a little bit Disney, but at the same time, when you find it, like when you find those instances of like, oh, that tree is literally clinging, like its roots wrapped around a rock, clinging horizontally, that, you know, it gives you that impression of autonomy, of like pure power and force as well. And I think you capture it so beautifully in your work. There are a few more questions. I think they're quick ones, because I know we have to wrap up just before 2:15. But Emily Parton says, what role, if any, does photography play in your process? And then we also got a question about photos of the maquettes, if there are any online.
Well, I'll answer. Hi, Erin. I know Erin. Thanks for your question. Photography really doesn't come much into it. I tried to do some things with like printing photo paper and like maybe cutting those up and seeing how that worked in a maquette. And it just, you know, I think because I'm so interested in, you know, leaving some residue of like the experiential, whether or not it's from the actual like still life of the model or for that original space that I'm investigating, that entering in another medium that kind of ruptures that space or acts as another screen, just, it doesn't really work in my practice. And if anything, I felt like I remember a moment when I was first figuring out how to even make paintings using like photography for collages and feeling like this is insufficient. Like it's someone, like I was using other people's photography, you know, like for magazines or whatever. So it was always like imbued with someone else's perspective, which was a just distraction for me. But I've tried to do it with my own work, and it's just, and there's nothing wrong with photography. I actually really love photography. Like my husband's a photographer. I look at a lot of photo projects. There's a lot of really interesting photography happening right now that really excites me. But it's not something I actually use in my practice.
I think what you do with painting creating that stack of painted paper and ripping and creating your own materials is really wonderful. We are almost at the end, so I think this is probably a good place to just say thank you to Emily and to Rachel and to everyone who attended and saw the show. If you haven't seen the show, please come and see it from 11 to 4, Saturday and Sunday at the MacLaren Art Centre. Yeah, and this was wonderful. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Bye.
Bye.
Nice to see your faces. Okay.